Welcome to today's session, which is the first of two seminars on issues pertaining to cyberspace, securing cyberspace and security. And of course, and we're very lucky to have to deliver these seminars Dr. Elena Chernenko, who is well known as a special correspondent at the Kommersant daily newspaper in Moscow, where she likes to focus on issues of cybersecurity and arms control. She's previously worked for Russian Newsweek, The Voice of Russia, the Moscow Deutsche Zeitung newspaper, and the Euractiv news agency. A woman of many accolades and even more talents, she holds a PhD in history from Moscow State University, and she is a member of the board of the Council on Foreign and Defense Relations and the Council of the Pearce Center. So without much further ado, I will give the floor to Elena to start her seminar. Thank you, Elena.
Thanks a lot, Jade, for introduction. Sorry, everyone, for having let you wait. We indeed had some technical problems. I'm very happy to see everybody, and thanks so much for inviting me to take part in this initiative. As far as I understand, that's the first one in such a kind, and I hope that everybody so far is enjoying it and learning new things. I have looked at your biographies. It's very impressive, and I have seen that quite a few people deal with different aspects of cyber and international institutions. Hope won't be boring for you, and I'm very happy to discuss any questions that arise at the end of this session. We don't have much time, but I hope to leave as much time as possible for a Q&A session. I will start then the presentation that I've prepared to. We had some technical problems with that, so I won't be able to show you a slideshow. You will be able to see the slides in the edit mode, I hope. Does everybody see the screen now? Wonderful. So as we have 2 days for this, I've divided my material into two parts. The first one will be international efforts to create norms of responsible behavior for states in cyberspace. And the second one, so that's the issue for today. Basically, concentrating mostly at the efforts at the UN, as this is the main venue where states are discussing this, and how their efforts are correlating with events and conflicts that do have a cyber aspect in them in real life, including today's events in Ukraine. And the second day, which is tomorrow, I would like us to focus on bilateral agreements and cooperation in cyberspace and efforts on the regional level, with a focus on what's being done between the US and Russia, US and China, and Russia and China, and then some other regional agreements, for example, in the NATO, in the Shanghai Security Cooperation Organization, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Why I have chosen these aspects of cyber diplomacy and cybersecurity is mainly because I focus on them and have started writing about this and have become interested in them more than 10 years ago, concentrating on them in my daily reporting. And I must admit that over the years, I have becoming maybe frustrated with this topic more and more. In the beginning, I was quite an enthusiast, and I really believe that those efforts that the international community is taking, and the three countries that are mainly represented in this initiative today, the US, Russia, and China, were at the front of all of this. I really believed, starting to cover these topics, that they would achieve something, that they could agree on things that would work in real life. Today, I'm more and more, as I say, frustrated and quite a pessimist. Maybe when we discuss the things, there will be more optimistic voices. I'm open and ready to hear all different opinions. But let's just start right on with what is being done at the UN. So at the UN, there's efforts for more than 20 years. It's now 24 years that diplomats from different countries are discussing the idea of maybe that we can create some norms for states. We're not talking about non-state actors, but we're talking about states. If they can regulate cyberspace, if they can agree on some norms of responsible behavior, so that cyberspace, the digital space, would become more safe for states and for their citizens, of course. The first resolution on this topic was tabled at the UN General Assembly as early as the late 90s. It was actually by Russia. It was quite a short document where only the importance of cyberspace for global security was highlighted. But this was the first step towards a process that now drags on more than 20 years. 6 years later, a special group was established, the UN Group of Governmental Experts on Cyber. It has a longer name. I will use a shorter acronym. So the UNGGE on Cyber. It was a closed group. So I think it was in the beginning, it was 15 states, then 20, and in the end, 25. But all of the three countries, China, Russia, and the US were present from the beginning in this process. And it was actually, again, Russia's idea to launch such a mechanism to try to discuss whether maybe there is a global convention possible on cybersecurity at the UN level. Russia seems to be, at this specific venue at the UN, a pioneer in cyber diplomacy. And when diplomats are confronted with a challenge, for example, with challenges that arose from conventional security threats, what did they do? They came up with ideas how to regulate them on the bilateral level, regional level, or at the best to create a global convention. And there is many conventions that are working successfully. So I think the idea, as far as I understand, in 2004 was from the beginning, can we maybe use all of the experience accumulated over the last decades in other spheres and maybe also elaborate a global convention on cyberspace. So this group was launched in 2004. It worked a few years with little success, but then starting with 2010 and especially at the session of 2015, it was able to produce a very important consensus report where the first ever international set of norms for states in cyberspace was created and delivered to the UN Secretary General. These norms, there's 11 of them. They represent the consensus by all of the participants of this group. So 25 states at that moment. I've taken the slide from the Swiss. I think they did the best job to really condense them into very short sentences. The norms are longer, but this is what they are about. So the first norm is that states should cooperate in cybersecurity. It sounds logical, but because there is no global international norms or conventions or laws that would cover all states, the first thing that they thought was needed is to call for states to cooperate in cybersecurity. The second norm is to consider all relevant information. If an incident arises between states in cyberspace, they thought it would be important that the conflict parties that are involved in this would consider all relevant information that is there about this incident. This norm is very important because attribution is quite hard in cyberspace. It is sometimes possible, sometimes really, really hard and almost impossible. And there's cases where third actors could be involved into kind of creating an attack that uses the infrastructure of other countries, while the real aggressor, the real attacker, is somebody that is hiding between several layers of infrastructure that they are using. So the governments involved into this effort to elaborate this first set of norms for states thought that they should consider all relevant information. Now, you probably know that there is no international court on cyber conflict. There is nothing where a state could go to and say, well, I was attacked and I think this was by another state. This is my proof. I would like justice, and the other party could present their information. There is nothing like that. So they thought it was important at least to call for states to consider everything that's there. The third norm is prevent the misuse of information and communication technologies in your territory, that means that if a government knows that its infrastructure, its territory, the server space there are being used by another state or a non-governmental malign actor to attack another country, they should do first everything to prevent this, to confirm the attacker, and to also inform the other state that is being attacked. So not allow your territory to be used for cyber attacks. The fourth norm is cooperate and stopping crime and terrorism. Now, as many of you probably know, there is a global document. You can call it global because over 60 states are participating in this to fight cybercrime. That's the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime from 2001, first elaborated by the Council of Europe, but then many states outside of the European area joined it. For example, China, Australia. Russia is so far the only Council of Europe country that has not joined this document. It has not done so because of one provision in this. It's quite a big document, but the Russian government, as early as 2001, did not like one provision, which allows, as Russia reads it, for cross-border operations. The idea is that, for example, if an attack is happening right now, the responsible bodies of one state, if they're being attacked from another state who is participant in the Budapest Convention, they could start already their efforts to stop this attack and investigate it, even though if the infrastructure that is being used is in the territory of another country, without first consulting the authorities of that country. So they could work on this as quickly as possible. The Budapest Convention seems to be allowing this. Now, Russia was considering this to be a breach of the right of sovereignty and an intervention into a country's internal affairs. The Russian government would like to be asked first, in any case, before another country is doing anything on its territory or on its cyber infrastructure. So that's that's the main reason why it hasn't joined the Budapest Convention. But that is not only Russia's concern. There's other countries that are also skeptical about this provision, and that makes this convention not it's international, but it's not global. So it's 60 states that are participating in it. The norm number 4, elaborated by the governmental group of experts, calls in very general words for governments to cooperate in fighting crime and cyber terrorism. The norm number 5 is obvious, is the respect of rights, human rights and privacy in cyberspace. A very important norm, number 6, not damage critical infrastructure using cyber means of another country. Every country has its own list of areas that is considered critical for the existence of the whole state. As far as I know, Russia has about 17 areas that it considers critical, starting from the banking sector, energetic sector, and others. The US, I think they have 13, and I couldn't find how many areas that China considers to be critical for part of the critical infrastructure. Maybe it just haven't looked that good. But so every state has a list of what it considers critical, and the experts thought that it would be important that all governments would agree that at any case, they never attack the main objects from this critical infrastructure. Now, number 7 is the duty of all states to invest in the protection of critical infrastructures, because the experts who participate in elaborating this norm, they all thought that governments are not doing enough themselves, so they should not attack others, but they also should do more efforts to protect their own infrastructure. To respond to requests for assistance, that's the norm number 8. Ensure security of chain supply. We'll go into this a bit later. To report the vulnerabilities that arise in the information and communication technology sector, and not harm emergency response teams that also exist in almost every country and are responsible to track in real life time incidents in cyberspace, alert the government about them, and respond to them. Now, this all sounds quite on the surface and sounds sometimes not very important, while behind every norm, I think personally, is a whole philosophy, and they're critically needed. They're very depoliticized, I think. If you look at them, maybe number 5, where the respect of human rights and privacy, it raises some political questions, but others, they're mostly depoliticized, very practical norms, where I think most governments, if they are really thinking about making cyberspace more secure and stabilized, they should be interested in adhering to them. Take, for example, the norm number 9, ensures supply chain security. It means that governments call on each other to not install any hidden malware into the IT products that are produced in their territory or shipped from their territory. Now, why is this important? Because governments are, of course, using the products that are produced in their country to install malware, for example, for espionage, and then ship it on to customers in other countries, especially if they know that this is somebody that's an interesting target for them. Sometimes it's hard to hack some organization or some person from the distance, and it's more convenient and useful to try to kind of send them technologies that they're using, hardware or software, which has already a hidden backdoor, which can then connect information from their devices and send it to whoever has installed this malware, or, for example, to disrupt the hardware or the software that they are using for the reasons of remote control. There is not much information about how this is being done because, of course, every government is interested in hiding this information. But we know, for example, one very clear case, it was highlighted by Edward Snowden, who has shown lots of material about how the US intelligence services operate in this area. And while there has not been so far a Russian Edward Snowden nor a Chinese one, so there is not much information we can draw upon from Russia and China, how they're doing this. But let's look at a very special case and how the US are doing this. So at the next slide, you see as a copy of a top secret document which was within the whole bunch of documents presented by Edward Snowden in 2013. This is a presentation from the National Security Agency in the US from 2010, where it shows how they work on supply chain interdiction. So sometimes they say that signal intelligence is very hard from thousands of miles away. So how it works to intercept it is that shipments of computer networks, for example, servers, routers, etc., are being delivered to our targets throughout the world, and they are then intercepted, redirected to a secret location, and then there's a tailored access operation, so they are tailored very much to the customers that they're interested in, installing implants into those electronic devices. Then those devices are repackaged and placed back into the transit to the original destination. Later then in the same presentation, it shows how it works, for example, in practical life. It worked in 2010, I think, with the Syrian Telecommunication Agency. The US government was interested in intercepting the government, the information that's running through the networks of the Syrian Telecommunications Agency, but also it wanted to be able to disrupt the internet in Syria. So it used this possibility to interdict the supply chain, install malware, and then ship it. It was a shipment from the US to Syria. And then when it came to Syria, it had already hidden malware installed into it. So when we look at rule number 9, it shows that this should be forbidden. Governments should not be doing this, not with other governments, not with normal customers. They agreed that this was not a good idea. Rule number 10, report vulnerabilities if you find them. Now, all the three governments from the US, from China, and Russia are basically doing the same. The hackers that are working in the different branches, in the military sphere, in the intelligence sphere, they're looking for vulnerabilities of software that is being used by their targets to try to create then exploits, infect their computers, and then do whatever they're wanting to do with it, espionage, disruption, and so forth. So the governments decided here that it would be a good idea to stop this. And then if they find vulnerabilities, they should report them to the vendors, for example, to Microsoft and to the IT giants that are developing those things. There was a special case which showed to the whole world how dangerous it is when governments are not reporting these vulnerabilities and are using them for their own needs, are creating exploits. So this case that I'm talking about is the WannaCry attack. It's called WannaCry attack in 2017. It was a ransomware attack where it blocked customers from their data unless they paid a ransom in Bitcoin. It infected more than 200,000 computers in over 150 countries, and China and Russia and the US were all among those countries, where Western countries were mostly affected, but it's almost the whole world. I remember in Russia where this happened, one of the newspapers reported there, for example, that computers at our Department of Homeland Securities were infected. At the Russian railways, this whole attack lasted for a few weeks. And for example, you could see where the monitors at the railway stations were not working. And even with one example where instead of showing the schedule of the trains, it showed the message from the WannaCry ransomware hackers telling that they had to pay ransom and Bitcoin to free this information. So it's still very hard to see how much damage this attack has caused, but it says from hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. So it was a very, very damaging attack. And what happened was that the WannaCry exploits that were used in these attacks, they were actually taken from the exploits stolen from the National Security Agency in the United States. So the NSA at some point found a vulnerability in a Microsoft product. It did not report this to Microsoft. Instead, it created an exploit to target whatever targets it's interested in. But some hackers hacked into the NSA, stole or copied this exploit, and then they were first trying to sell it on the internet. I'm not sure if actually it was then sold or maybe just somehow again stolen, but well, it doesn't matter. In the end, it ended up in the group of hackers. The US believes it was hackers from North Korea who started then this attack, who developed on the basis of this exploit this WannaCry virus that then attacked so many targets around the world. It was this attack that led to the first appeal of Brad Smith from Microsoft, the president of Microsoft, to call on the governments all around the world with a big open letter. And I'm presenting just a short quote from it, that we should all take from this attack a renewed determination for more urgent collective action. We need the tech sector, customers, and governments to work together to protect against cybersecurity attacks. More action is needed, and it's needed now. In this sense, the WannaCry attack is a wake-up call for all of us. Now, he drafted this letter in 2017 and published it back then. It's 5 years later on, nothing happened. There is still no agreement between governments to report on the vulnerabilities that they are detecting in the software that is being used around the world. So this really wasn't a wake-up call, although even at the UN level, governments agreed to that it was a good idea to report vulnerabilities instead of using them. So coming back to our norms, we see that they're voluntary, unfortunately. They have no binding status. It's more a moral code for the government, but it's no legally binding norms. Then in 2018, a new mechanism was launched at the United Nations, again presented by Russia. I won't go very deep into details. It's very intriguing how these two mechanisms, that governmental group of experts and then this new open-ended working group, they first kind of were fighting a bit against each other. Russia was trying to attract people to this new mechanisms, to the open-ended working group, where it said all countries of the world can participate. It's not closed, it's open. Also, the business can participate, non-governmental organizations can participate. It would be more democratic, more inclusive, but basically working again at the same agenda, trying to make digital space more safe and create some norms for states of responsible behavior. The US was first sticking to that older mechanism, the governmental group of experts. In the end, though they did not fight against each other, they managed to work together. And 1 year ago, Russia and the US presented a joint resolution at the UN General Assembly, highlighting the importance of both of the groups, which was taken as a very, very good sign for the international community that finally those two countries agree on something that means that there will be more progress. Unfortunately, because of the conflict around Ukraine, all of the efforts in this area stalled. There was another meeting of the open-ended working group just 1.5 months ago in July. This group reconfirmed those 11 principles, 11 norms. It elaborated on them, so it made them longer. It showed how they could be applied to cases in real life, added some more depth into them. But unfortunately, it did not so far also make important progress towards making these norms binding or more used in real life. At this last session that I was talking about in July, for example, they took much longer to discuss some procedures. For example, whether non-governmental organizations and businesses should have a formal status at the session or a secondary status. So should they be able to speak out and ask questions at the main sessions or only at side events? And because of the conflict around Ukraine, Russia blocked 30-something non-governmental organizations that had either ties to Ukraine or to Western countries, which is now they are considered now hostile countries or non-friendly countries in Russia. So Russia blocked them. Ukraine and some Western countries blocked almost all organizations, non-governmental or business, that applied to take part from Russia. For example, universities or the Kaspersky Laboratory. And this was the main intrigue at this session. So instead of discussing how do we make cyberspace more secure, they were discussing on this is our blacklist, that's your blacklist, and who is allowed to speak and who is not. I think that's a pity, but this is where we are right now. So at the UN, at the most important international venue, right now there is a process that took longer than 20 years, which basically led to not really much, one must admit. While in real life, there are, of course, conflicts between states that are having the cyber aspect in them, fully or partly. And I want to show you some cases that I think are important. About some of them you absolutely know, some maybe not as much in details. I'm not taking all of the important ones. I'm just taking a few to show how those 11 norms, if they were binding or half binding something, how they could be applied to these conflicts and maybe help either prevent them or try to work them in the aftermath. Let's take, for example, the Stuxnet attack. There was a virus that paralyzed the Iranian nuclear program in 2010. So the malware infected the centrifuge control system at the Natanz nuclear center, and the centrifuges started spinning much faster than they were supposed to. Almost, I think, 1/5 of the centrifuges were destroyed, and the Iranian nuclear program back then slowed for more than a year. The attacker behind this is the US and Israel. We know this in detail from a great book that I recommend everybody reading. It's one of my favorite ones from David Sanger, Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power. Confront and Conceal. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the New York Times, and he wrote in detail about how this program, it was called the Olympic Games, the secret program between the US and Israel that led to the creation of the Stuxnet virus, was developed. Fascinating to read. So this was one of the first examples of the use of cyber weapons in an interstate conflict. So conflict between the US and Israel on one side and Iran on the other side. What norm could have been used here? Well, norm number 6, I think at least, just coming back to the slides, number 6 is do not damage critical infrastructure. It's clear that all objects that relate to the peaceful use of nuclear energy, but also the militarized objects are part of the critical infrastructure. Everything that is nuclear is usually considered by all states to be part of the critical infrastructure. So this is a clear violation against this norm. Another case is the Democratic National Committee hack from 2016. It started during the US election campaign. Back then, the server of the DNC was hacked. More than 20,000 emails were transferred then to the platform WikiLeaks and published partly on WikiLeaks, partly on other servers. The damage was the reputation of the Democratic National Committee and the candidate from the Democrats, Hillary Clinton. There were dismissals in the committee. There is information on clear influence on election results, although disputed by some experts. The US authorities accused Russia of being behind this attack. Russia denied the involvement, although said that maybe some pro-Russian hacking groups could have been involved in this. There's lots of pros and cons for either of the versions of this. First, I was very skeptical that the Russian government was behind this. Then, because the US did not present for quite a long time technical information connected to this hack. Then there was an indictment by the US Department of Justice, which was published, I think, in 2018. And it gave much more information that made me then rethink my position. Well, whatever the consequences, this was showing very clear the potential of cyber means and cyber attacks as a political and geopolitical tool. Now, if we consider this attack and look at it from this set of norms, what norms could have been used to prevent it or then to research it afterwards? Let's look again at the norms. Well, the cooperation on cybersecurity, clearly there was none. Considering all relevant information did not go very well too, because Russia was saying that, well, at least from the Russian government point of view, it said that the US is accusing Russia without really having looked at all of the information on the table. The misuse of your territory to launch cyber attacks. For example, if we take the version that it wasn't the Russian government, not the Russian intelligence services, but some hacker group operating from the Russian territory, and then that hacked into the Democratic National Committee servers, the Russian government would still be obliged to stop such kind of attacks if it was knowing about them, or to then persecute the hackers if it was then informed by the US that something is happening on their territory. There was clearly not enough cooperation to stop cybercrime if it was a crime act and not a government organized attack. Critical infrastructure is also another question, because the US considers servers that have to do with that are being owned by the government or by government institutions or by political entities, in this case, the Democratic Party, to be part of the critical infrastructure. Maybe there was a violation of rule number 7 that not enough was done by the Democrats themselves to protect their infrastructure. The respond about for assistance is a very interesting case because the US actually asked the Russian government for assistance to clarify this case. It sent a letter as early, I think, as October 2016 to Russia. Russia then reacted with a clarification letter where it asked for more information and clarification. So they responded, but I say that the information that the US provided was not enough. The US then provided some more information, and the Russians answered again. The Russian officials that I was talking to when working on stories about them, they claimed that they showed their American counterparts enough to be sure that it was not the Russian government that was behind this attack, while the US representatives are saying just the opposite, that they are very sure that the Russian government was behind this attack. So at least 6 or 7 norms that could have been used in this case, they were not really used in the end. The Colonial Pipeline attack from last year. The dark side group intruders, with the help of a ransom virus, were able to hit devices and encrypt information. In the US, they demanded a ransom, and then the company Colonial Pipeline actually paid them almost $5 million in bitcoins. They got some of it back later with the help of the FBI. But the state of emergency was declared in 17 states. There was gasoline shortages, canceling of flights, and psychological damage to the population. The US claimed that the dark side group is at least partially based in Russia. And this is one of the largest hacking critical information, economical critical information in the United States. Then the issue rose to the presidential level because it was so important, so critical. Here we see that at least norms 3 and 4 and 8 could have been used to either prevent this or work on this to stop the damage from spreading later. The norms here are prevent the misuse of your territory for cybercrime. If we are talking about really that the dark side hacker groups is based at least partially in Russia, it would have been the responsibility, according to this norm, of the Russian government to do everything to stop them from spreading this ransomware once they were informed by the US government. Then norm number 4, to do everything to cooperate with the government or with the country attacked, with the US, to stop this. And then also number 6 is the prohibition to damage critical infrastructure. If we take the point of the US government that somehow the Russian authorities were either knowing about this attack or maybe allowing it or somehow even taking part in this. And the last case is very timely, is from right now, the conflict in and around Ukraine. I do not agree with the Russian government definition of this conflict, which is being called here a special operation. But because I am based in Moscow in Russia, and because the use of other terms to describe this are persecuted by law, even in a presentation like this, because it's being recorded, just for the record, I'm saying that I'm not using the words that I would probably use in another case. But so we see lots of cyber hacking elements around these fight and around this operation. We see hacking both by Russia and by Ukraine, and the supporters of Ukraine, the so-called Ukraine IT army. I've asked the colleagues from Monterey to send you around 2 readings. One of was on these, it was a very good Carnegie review of this effort at the UN. And another one was a very recent report done by experts from Switzerland on the Ukrainian IT army, a fascinating read of a first example of how hybrid IT army of a country and its supporters can look like, and how it is contrary to all of the reports, all of the efforts of the international community that is trying to look at cyber events in a conventional way and try to kind of regulate them, fit them into conventional schemes. If you have read these reports, you will probably understand how difficult it is to assess all of these trends with traditional, for example, diplomacy. And this relates very much to the topic that is close to my heart, and then that I'm talking about today is how technology, how warfare, and all of this, how this is much faster than traditional diplomacy that is basically, in my personal point of view, almost doomed to fail in trying to catch up to regulate processes that are much further away from what diplomats are able to do. So we see, for example, there is many different cyber attacks that have been part of these last 6 months of fighting. One of the most known one was, for example, that according to U.S. and European intelligence services and companies trying to research on this, that according to them, the Russian government was trying to take down the Ukrainian satellite communication network prior to February 24th. While, for example, Ukraine and its supporters within this Ukraine so-called IT army targeted a whole range of targets in Russia. What the Ukrainian government did on the second day of, I think it was on February 25th, the representatives of the Ukrainian government made an appeal, a call to the Ukrainians within the country, to the Ukrainians outside of the country, and to everybody that is sympathizing with the cause of Ukraine to join them into efforts in punishing Russia for its military operation and attacking specific targets within Russia. It has published the first set of those targets that should be attacked, mostly governmental services and institutions. And if you looked at this report, some of these efforts to target them were quite successful. Some of them were minor, some of them had more success. But I remember, for example, that some weeks ago there is a very popular and wide used app for accessing governmental services in Russia, which is called Gosuslugi. It was not working for quite a while, and then the government admitted that it was due to an attack, as they said, from Ukraine. Damage has to be yet assessed because it's still all going on, and there is initial efforts to see what is the cyber aspect of this war, but because it's still going on, there's only initial approaches to this. And attackers are both governmental and non-governmental structures, because on the Russian side, there is no such something as an IT army, which would be comprised of government and non-governmental parts working together and coordinating together, at least not in this form as it happens right now in Ukraine. But we see many examples of hacking groups, patriotic hacking groups, joining the Russian cause and doing, for example, declaring on telegrams which targets in non-friendly countries they are now targeting. For example, many of them in Lithuania, in Poland. So the consequences is that there is all kinds of cyber attacks used right now in this conflict. There is disruption, for example, the effort to disrupt the satellite networks. There's clearly espionage effort through cyber networks. There is many cases of defacement of websites. We have seen this in Russia, where the hackers close to the IT army from Ukraine, they defaced Russian governmental sites. For example, if you open, some ministries, for example, for education in Russia, and also some TV channels, if you open their website or apps, instead of the usual front page, they would show you an appeal from Ukraine to stop the fights. DDoS, the easiest form of attack, so just overflowing a target with traffic, so it would stop working. So this is all now part of this modern day hybrid war. I could have listed almost all of the norms that are not being used or being violated within this framework of this conflict. So it's clearly norm number one about there is no cooperation. The countries are both letting the territories being used for cyber attacks against others. There is no common efforts to fight cybercrime, and critical infrastructure is clearly being attacked. So we see that in Ukraine right now demonstrated very vividly how the goodwill and the good ideas developed in peace times by government, but having not been ever made binding, they're basically being useless because we are confronted with such a new style of a war, of a military conflict with a cyber aspect in it. And you can only say how many good ideas from these norms, for example, that have not been used. So my question is to you, and I'm very interested in your opinion, whether you think that those global efforts on cyber were all in vain. I'm talking now specifically about these 20 years at the UN. Does it still make sense, you think, to continue this? Is this moral codex of this 11 norms useful, even if not binding? Maybe you would recommend some other norms or some other international fora to be used. Let's say there is also efforts at the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or smaller organizations, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And do you think is diplomacy able at all to speed up and catch up with technology and modern day warfare? So these are my initial questions. Maybe you have some totally others or just an ideas. I'm now stopping the demonstration, and we do have about 20-25 minutes to discuss all of this.